You think you know what isolation means? You think your pandemic lockdowns were unbearable? Let me tell you something that will make your comfortable quarantine look like a luxury vacation. Tonight, while you're safe in your sanitized world, I'm going to drag you into the most forsaken places humanity ever created, medieval leper colonies. And when I'm done peeling back the rotting layers of this buried truth, you'll never look at modern medicine, social distancing, or even your own reflection the same way again. Picture this. It's 1347, and you wake up with a small, painless patch of discolored skin on your arm. Just a spot, nothing more. But in medieval Europe, that innocent mark is your death sentence, or worse, your living burial, because what's coming for you isn't death, it's something far more twisted. The Church, in its infinite mercy, has created a special place just for people like you. They call them leprosariums, but I call them what they really were, human disposal sites dressed up as charity. Here's the part they don't teach in history books. The moment you were diagnosed with leprosy, you were legally dead. Not metaphorically dead, literally dead. A priest would perform your funeral rites, while you stood there breathing, watching your own burial ceremony. Your property was divided among your heirs. Your marriage was dissolved. Your children were forbidden from acknowledging you as their parent. In the eyes of God, society, and the law, you had ceased to exist. But your body, your rotting, betraying body, that still had to go somewhere. The leprosarium wasn't a hospital. Hospitals were for people who might get better. This was a graveyard where the corpses happened to still be walking around. The irony is delicious, isn't it? Medieval society, so obsessed with purity and salvation, created these elaborate monuments to their own cruelty. They built these places just outside their cities, close enough to feel good about their Christian charity, far enough away to forget the screaming. St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, Sherborne Hospital near Durham, hundreds of these places scattered across Europe like pockmarks on the face of civilization. Each one a testament to humanity's endless creativity when it comes to sanctified torture. The wealthy endowed them, the Church blessed them, and society celebrated them as acts of divine compassion. Meanwhile, inside these walls, human beings were decomposing while still alive, and everyone pretended this was somehow merciful. You want to know what your typical day looked like as a medieval leper? First, forget everything you think you know about medical care. There was no treatment, no hope of recovery, no pain management. Your job was to rot gracefully while praising God for the privilege. You'd wake up in a dormitory filled with the living dead, 20, 30, sometimes 50 bodies in various stages of decomposition, all crammed together in stone cells that stayed damp year-round. The smell? Imagine sewage mixed with gangrene and holy incense. The residents couldn't feel pain in their extremities anymore. The disease destroyed their nerve endings, so they'd wake up to find fingers that had fallen off during the night, toes that had detached and were lying somewhere in the straw bedding like discarded pieces of meat. But here's the truly horrific part. They had to search for these body parts and dispose of them properly, because leaving human remains lying around was considered unholy. Your hands would be clawed into permanent grips around a wooden clapper, a noisemaker that announced your presence to the world. Medieval law required lepers to warn healthy people of their approach. Unclean, unclean, you'd call out, like some biblical nightmare come to life. But that clapper wasn't just for warning, it was for begging. Because even though you were legally dead, you still needed to eat. And the only way to get food was to stand at crossroads and market squares, clattering your wooden herald of decay, hoping someone would toss you scraps without getting close enough to catch your curse. The Church taught that leprosy was God's punishment for sin, usually sexual sin. So not only were you rotting alive, you were also branded as a deviant whose corruption was so profound it literally oozed out of your skin. Your family was ashamed of you, society feared you, and the Church used you as a living sermon about the wages of wickedness. You were a walking moral lesson that breathed and bled and begged for mercy that would never come. But here's where it gets really twisted. Some of these leprosariums were actually profitable enterprises. The Church collected donations for their maintenance. Wealthy patrons left money in their wills for the care of lepers, and pilgrims would visit to gain indulgences by witnessing suffering. The lepers themselves became a commodity. Their visible agony was literally worth money to the religious establishment. The worse you looked, the more donations poured in. Your decomposition was funding someone else's salvation. At night, in those stone dormitories, you'd listen to the sound of other residents slowly coming apart. The wet sounds of flesh separating from bone, the scraping of fingernails that were barely attached, the whimpering of people whose faces were caving in on themselves. Some had lost their noses entirely, just holes where features used to be. Others had hands that were nothing but stumps wrapped in rags. The fortunate ones died quickly from secondary infections. The unlucky ones lingered for years, decades even, becoming less human with each passing season. The daily routine was designed to maximize both suffering and piety. Morning prayers, while your extremities fell apart. Afternoon begging sessions, where you displayed your decay for public charity. Evening confession, where you thanked God for your affliction. Every aspect of your existence was choreographed to extract the maximum spiritual benefit from your physical destruction. You weren't just dying, You were performing your death for an audience that needed to believe your suffering served some divine purpose. And the truly maddening part, many of the people confined in these places didn't even have leprosy. Medieval medicine couldn't distinguish between true leprosy and dozens of other skin conditions. Eczema, psoriasis, even severe acne could get you branded as a leper and shipped off to rot. Once you were inside those walls, accurate diagnosis became irrelevant. You were there to represent leprosy, to embody sin made flesh, to serve as a living reminder of God's wrath. The truth of your condition was less important than the symbol you had become. Your isolation wasn't just physical, it was ontological. You existed in a space between life and death, between human and monster, between mercy and cruelty. The medieval world had created a special category of existence just for you. The living dead, the breathing corpse, the walking sermon. You were simultaneously the most visible and most invisible members of society, constantly on display as moral warnings, yet completely erased as individual human beings. But this story, this isn't buried in some dusty medieval tomb. The next time you see someone crossing the street to avoid a homeless person, remember the leper's clapper. When you watch society debate who deserves health care and who doesn't, think about those funeral rites for the living. Notice how little we've changed in our fundamental need to create categories of people who don't quite count as fully human. If anything has changed at all, now let me take you deeper into this rabbit hole of sanctified horror, because what I just showed you is merely the appetizer. The real feast of human cruelty was served daily within those leprosarium walls, and the menu was written by people who genuinely believed they were doing God's work. You think modern institutional abuse is bad? You haven't seen anything yet. Here's what nobody talks about: the hierarchy of decay. Even among the damned, there were social structures, power dynamics, and a twisted economy of flesh and suffering. The leprosarium wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a functioning micro-society where your social status was determined by how much of your body you still had left. The recently diagnosed, still mostly intact, formed the upper class. They could work, beg effectively, and maintain some semblance of their former humanity. At the bottom of this grotesque pyramid were the advanced cases. The faceless, the limbless, the ones whose condition had progressed so far that they were more whole than human. The metro, or master of the leprosarium, usually a leper himself who still retained enough cognitive function to manage the place, wielded absolute power over this kingdom of the rotting. He decided who got the better sleeping spots, who received the larger portions of donated food, and most importantly, who got to leave the grounds to beg. Because here's the sick joke. Begging wasn't just about survival, it was about privilege. The most successful beggars were those whose appearance struck the perfect balance between pitiful and not completely repulsive. Too healthy looking, and people wouldn't donate. Too far gone, and they'd run away in terror without dropping a coin. The church had even codified this nightmare into law. The rules of St. Augustine, adapted for leprosaria, specified exactly how these places should operate. Wake at dawn for prayers, work until midday if physically capable, afternoon begging sessions, evening prayers, lights out by Compline. But between these official activities was where the real horror lived, in the spaces where human nature, stripped of all social pretense, revealed itself in its rawest form. Sexual relationships within leprosaria were officially forbidden but practically inevitable. Imagine the psychological torture of being declared dead to the world, your marriage dissolved, your sexuality branded as the very sin that caused your condition, and then being locked in close quarters with dozens of other people experiencing the same existential crisis. The church authorities knew this would happen, but addressing it directly would have undermined their narrative that leprosy was divine punishment for sexual transgressions, so they pretended not to see, while creating rules that made any human intimacy a violation of holy law. The result was a shadow economy of flesh, affection, and power that operated alongside the official religious structure. Those with intact hands could offer services to those without, feeding, cleaning, writing letters to family members who would never respond. In return, they might receive protection, better food allocations, or simply the touch of another human being who didn't recoil in disgust. These relationships existed in a legal and moral gray area that drove many residents to complete psychological breakdown. Children born in leprosaria, and yes, children were born in these places, occupied the most tragic position in this hierarchy. They weren't necessarily infected themselves, but they were considered contaminated by association. Some institutions allowed healthy children to be removed at age 7, but many kept them permanently, reasoning that they were too spiritually corrupted by their birth circumstances to be safely reintegrated into normal society. These children grew up knowing no world outside the leprosarium walls, their entire understanding of human existence shaped by decay, abandonment, and institutionalized cruelty disguised as mercy. The food system in these places was a masterpiece of psychological torture. Donations came irregularly, sometimes feasts when a wealthy patron died and left provisions in their will, sometimes famine when public attention turned elsewhere. But the real cruelty was in the distribution. Food was allocated based on your ability to contribute to the community. which created a vicious cycle where those who were sickest received the least nutrition, hastening their decline and further reducing their ability to contribute. Meat was rare, usually reserved for feast days or when a donor specifically provided it. The standard diet was bread, thin porridge, and whatever vegetables could be grown in the leprosarium's garden, if it had one. But here's the detail that will make your skin crawl. Residents often couldn't taste their food anymore. Advanced leprosy destroyed the nerves in the mouth and tongue, so meals became purely about maintaining enough energy to survive another day. The act of eating, one of life's most basic pleasures, became mechanical and joyless, just another reminder of how much humanity they'd lost. Water was another instrument of torment. Many leprosaria were intentionally built near marshes or stagnant ponds, areas where land was cheap because healthy people wouldn't want to live there. The water was often contaminated, leading to dysentery and other diseases that the residents were too weak to fight off. But they had no choice. The wells within the leprosarium grounds were their only source, and leaving to find fresh water was usually forbidden. The bathing arrangements, when they existed at all, were communal and degrading. Large wooden tubs filled with water that was changed infrequently, if ever. Residents would bathe in order of hierarchy, with the most decomposed going last, sitting in water that was already contaminated with the bodily fluids of dozens of others. Many chose not to bathe at all, which only added to the overwhelming stench that marked these places from miles away. Winter was when the leprosaria truly revealed their nature as elaborate death camps. The stone buildings were impossible to heat adequately, and residents with compromised circulation and open wounds were particularly vulnerable to cold. Frostbite was common, but since advanced lepers couldn't feel their extremities anyway, many wouldn't realize they were freezing until appendages turned black with necrosis. The mortality rate in winter months could reach 50% in some institutions. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was the mail system, or rather, the lack of one. Letters to family members were usually returned unopened. Former friends pretended not to recognize lepers when they encountered them begging in the streets. The outside world didn't just abandon these people, it actively erased them from memory. They became non-persons, their former lives treated as if they had never existed. The record-keeping in these places tells its own horrific story. Residents weren't tracked as individuals, but as inventory. Numbers of bodies to feed, spaces to fill, deaths to record. When someone died, they were usually buried in mass graves within the leprosarium grounds, with no markers, no names, no acknowledgement that a specific human being had lived and suffered there. They disappeared not just from life, but from history itself. Religious services in leprosaria were mandatory and frequent, but they weren't about comfort or salvation. They were about reinforcement of the narrative that made the suffering acceptable to medieval society. Every sermon emphasized that leprosy was God's will, that suffering purified the soul, that earthly agony was preparation for heavenly reward. Residents were required to publicly confess their sins, the supposed moral failings that had brought this punishment upon them. They had to participate in their own spiritual destruction, acknowledging their worthlessness before God and man. And here's the truly diabolical part. Some residents began to believe it. After years of being told they were divine punishment made flesh, some internalized this message completely. They became grateful for their suffering, convinced that their rotting bodies were earning them salvation. This psychological Stockholm syndrome with their own degradation was held up by church authorities as proof of the leprosarium system's spiritual success. But the most insidious aspect of leprosarium life was how it created a twisted mirror of normal medieval society. There were feast days and fasts, work assignments and leisure time, social hierarchies and political intrigue, all the structures of regular community life, but warped through the lens of abandonment and decay. Residents formed friendships, rivalries, romances, and grudges, just like people anywhere else. They gossiped, schemed, hoped, and despaired. They remained fundamentally human, even as their humanity was systematically denied and stripped away. This wasn't just medical quarantine, it was social experimentation on a massive scale. Medieval society was testing how much suffering human beings could endure while still functioning as a community. They were exploring the boundaries between life and death, between human and non-human, between mercy and cruelty. The leprosarium was their laboratory, and the residents were their unwilling subjects in an experiment that lasted for centuries. But this medieval nightmare didn't end with the Middle Ages. These institutions, these systems of sanctified abandonment, these methods of turning human suffering into moral theater, they evolved. Next time you pass by a homeless encampment that's been pushed to the edge of town, notice how familiar the geography feels. When you hear politicians debate who deserves medical care and who should be left to suffer for their supposed moral failing, listen for the echo of those medieval sermons. The leprosarium never really disappeared. It just learned to hide its true face behind more modern masks. You want to know the most terrifying part about medieval leprosaria? They worked exactly as designed. Not as hospitals, not as charity institutions, but as elaborate machines for transforming human beings into moral lessons while extracting maximum profit from their degradation. And the people who ran these places weren't monsters. They were respected members of society, pillars of their communities, devout Christians who genuinely believed they were doing God's work. That's what should keep you awake at night. Let me introduce you to some of these holy entrepreneurs. Master Robert de Sigillo, who ran the Leprosarium at Burton Lazars in England during the early 13th century, was also a successful merchant who used his position to secure lucrative contracts for supplying other religious institutions. The Leprosarium wasn't his charitable obligation, it was his business empire's cornerstone. He leveraged the suffering of his residents into political connections, social status, and considerable wealth. When he died, he was buried with honor in the local cathedral, celebrated as a saint-like figure who had dedicated his life to serving the afflicted. The financial records from places like Sherborne Hospital reveal the true economics of medieval income from donations, land rents, and bequests often exceeded expenses by enormous margins. The surplus wasn't returned to improve conditions for residents. It was invested in more property, used to build grander churches, or simply disappeared into the pockets of administrators. The lepers themselves were generating wealth they would never see, trapped in a system that profited from keeping them just sick enough to inspire pity, but not so sick they couldn't perform their function as living advertisements for Christian charity. But here's where the story gets truly nauseating: the medical experimentation. With a captive population of people who were already considered dead to the world, leprosaria became testing grounds for every quack cure and sadistic treatment medieval medicine could devise. Mercury poisoning, deliberate starvation, cauterization with red-hot irons, bloodletting until unconsciousness, all performed without consent on people who had no legal recourse and no voice to complain. The most popular treatment was something called chalmugra oil, extracted from seeds of a tree found in Southeast Asia. This expensive import was applied directly to open wounds and lesions, causing excruciating pain that residents were told to endure as penance for their sins. The oil had no therapeutic value whatsoever, but it was profitable to import and painful to apply, which made it perfect for the leprosarium business model. Pain was proof of moral purification, and profit was proof of divine blessing. Some institutions went further into the realm of pure sadism. At the leper house of Saint-Gilles near Pont-Audemer, residents were subjected to spiritual purification, rituals that involved exposure to extreme temperatures, locked naked in ice houses during winter, forced to lie on sun-baked stones during summer. The justification was that physical suffering burned away spiritual corruption, but the reality was that these practices shortened already limited lifespans while providing entertainment for wealthy patrons who would visit to witness the spectacle of human endurance. The clothing system in leprosaria deserves special mention as a masterpiece of psychological torture disguised as practical necessity. Residents were required to wear distinctive garments that marked them as lepers, usually gray or black robes with specific symbols sewn onto them. But these weren't just uniforms. They were designed to maximize both visibility and dehumanization. The fabric was deliberately rough and irritating against diseased skin. The fit was intentionally uncomfortable, and the colors were chosen to make the wearer appear corpse-like even from a distance. More insidiously, residents were forbidden from altering or personalizing their clothing in any way. No decorations, no repairs that might make the garment more comfortable, no modifications that would allow for individual expression. They were living mannequins displaying the uniform of divine punishment, not people entitled to basic comfort or dignity. When clothing wore out, replacement was sporadic and often deliberately delayed, forcing residents to wear rags that further emphasized their degraded status. The sexual politics within leprosaria created a secondary layer of horror that medieval records only hint at, but the implications are unmistakable. Women residents were considered even more morally corrupted than men, since medieval theology held that female sexuality was inherently more sinful. They were housed separately but given less food, assigned the most degrading tasks, and subjected to additional purification rituals that bordered on systematic abuse. Pregnant women in leprosaria faced a particularly cruel fate. Their condition was seen as evidence of continued sinful behavior even after divine punishment had begun, marking them as irredeemably corrupt. Many were forcibly separated from their newborns immediately after birth, told that their touch would contaminate the infant's soul. These women would spend their remaining years haunted by the knowledge that their children were growing up somewhere beyond the leprosarium walls, forbidden from ever acknowledging their mother's existence. The visiting protocols reveal another dimension of institutionalized cruelty. Family members who wanted to see their leprous relatives had to follow elaborate rituals designed to emphasize the infected person's status as spiritually dead. Visitors couldn't touch the resident, couldn't share food or drink, and had to maintain a specific physical distance at all times. Conversations were conducted across barriers, literal walls between the living and the living dead. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was the gift-giving protocol. Visitors were encouraged to bring donations to the leprosarium rather than personal items for their relative. Money, food, or goods given to the institution would earn the donor spiritual merit, while gifts to individual lepers were considered spiritually worthless and potentially contaminating. This system ensured that even family visits reinforced the message that the leper's individual humanity was less important than their function as a vehicle for others' salvation. The record-keeping systems in these places tell their own horror story. Residents weren't tracked as individuals with names and personal histories, but as inventory items with catalog numbers. Patient 47 or female 12, their former identities were erased as completely as their legal existence. When they died, the record simply noted, "Number removed from inventory," alongside the date. No cause of death, no acknowledgement of a life ended, just an accounting adjustment. Some leprosaria kept detailed financial records of how much each resident generated in donations. The most productive lepers, those whose appearance inspired the greatest pity and largest contributions, received marginally better treatment to preserve their earning potential. The least productive were often moved to back quarters where they wouldn't be seen by potential donors, left to die in even greater isolation and neglect. The seasonal rhythms of leprosarium life were synchronized not with natural cycles or human needs, but with the donation calendar. Christmas brought feasts funded by wealthy patrons who wanted to demonstrate their charity during the holy season, but the rest of winter was often a period of deliberate deprivation designed to make residents look more pitiable by spring, when traveling merchants and pilgrims would resume their donations. Easter was particularly perverse, a time when lepers were paraded before healthy communities as living reminders of mortality and sin. They would be marched through town squares, their decay on full display, while priests delivered sermons about death and judgment. The residents were forced to participate in their own dehumanization, calling out prescribed phrases about their unworthiness and gratitude for society's mercy. This wasn't religious observance, it was performance art using human suffering as the medium. The most successful leprosaria developed what we might recognize today as branding strategies. They cultivated reputations for housing the most dramatically afflicted cases, the most spiritually reformed sinners, or the most grateful recipients of divine punishment. Pilgrims would plan their routes to include visits to famous leper houses, just as modern tourists visit historical sites. The residents became attractions, their suffering commodified and packaged for spiritual consumption. But here's the detail that should make your blood run cold. Children from wealthy families were sometimes brought to leprosaria as educational experiences. Parents wanted their offspring to witness the wages of sin firsthand, to see what happened to people who strayed from moral righteousness. These field trips to human misery were considered valuable character-building exercises, teaching proper Christian values through exposure to divine justice in action. The children would stand safely behind barriers, staring at the residents like animals in a zoo, while adults explained the moral lessons embodied in each stage of decay. "See how sin corrupts the flesh," they would say, pointing at a woman whose face was collapsing inward. "Remember this when you're tempted to stray from God's path." The lepers were required to remain motionless during these visits, to serve as silent object lessons in divine retribution. Some leprosaria even developed educational programs, creating guided tours with standardized presentations about different stages of leprosy and their corresponding spiritual meanings. They produced illustrated manuscripts showing the progression of divine punishment, using their residents as live models. These institutions weren't just warehouses for the unwanted. They were teaching hospitals where the curriculum was human degradation and the textbooks were living flesh. And the most chilling part? The visitors always left feeling better about themselves. They had seen true suffering, witnessed divine justice, and contributed to Christian charity, all in one convenient trip. They returned to their comfortable lives with renewed appreciation for their blessings and confirmation that the world was a just place where punishment fit the crime. The lepers had served their purpose, not as human beings deserving compassion, but as moral theater that reinforced society's existing beliefs about virtue, punishment, and the proper order of things. But this system of organized abandonment disguised as mercy didn't vanish with medieval times. Look around you right now in your modern world and notice how we still create categories of people whose suffering we can ignore because we've convinced ourselves they somehow deserve it. The leprosarium is still here. It just wears different clothes and speaks in updated moral languages. The faces change, but the fundamental mechanics of sanctified cruelty remain exactly the same. Now let me show you something that will make you question everything you think you know about medieval religion, medicine, and human nature, because the most horrifying truth about leprosaria isn't what happened inside them. It's how perfectly they reflected the values of the society that created them. These weren't aberrations or mistakes. They were the logical conclusion of a worldview that saw suffering as spiritually profitable and abandonment as divinely ordained. The church didn't just tolerate leprosaria, it innovated them. St. Basil the Great, one of the founding fathers of Eastern Christianity, personally designed the first large-scale leprosarium in Caesarea around 370 AD. This wasn't some desperate response to a medical crisis. It was a calculated theological experiment. Basil wanted to create a visible demonstration of Christian charity that would also serve as a living sermon about sin, punishment, and redemption. The lepers weren't patients to be healed. They were props in an elaborate morality play that would run continuously for over 1,000 years. The architectural plans for medieval leprosaria reveal their true purpose with chilling clarity. These buildings were designed not for medical treatment or even basic comfort, but for maximum visibility and psychological impact. The dormitories had large windows facing the main roads, ensuring that passers-by could see the residents and be reminded of divine justice. The chapels were positioned so that the sounds of prayers and lamentations would carry to nearby settlements. Even the garden layouts were planned to create specific sight lines that would frame the lepers in appropriately pitiful tableau for visiting donors. But here's what makes this truly diabolical. The leprosaria were deliberately kept in a state of perpetual crisis, not because of neglect or incompetence, but because crisis was profitable. When conditions were at their worst, donations peaked. When residents looked most desperate, wealthy patrons felt most generous. The administrators learned that maintaining a careful balance between outright death and visible suffering maximized both charitable contributions and spiritual benefits for donors. The medical records from places like Mont-aux-Malades near Rouen show that administrators would sometimes withhold food or medicine to ensure residents looked appropriately wretched during high donation periods. Feast days, royal visits, or the arrival of wealthy pilgrims would trigger deliberate deprivation campaigns designed to make the lepers appear more needy. Their suffering wasn't just commodified, it was choreographed. The legal framework surrounding leprosaria reveals another layer of institutional sadism. Medieval law classified lepers as civil dead. They couldn't own property, enter contracts, or testify in court. But they could still be prosecuted for crimes, including the crime of being insufficiently grateful for society's mercy. Lepers who complained about conditions, attempted to leave their assigned leprosarium, or failed to display proper deference could be charged with ingratitude and subjected to additional punishments. These punishment systems within the leprosaria created a secondary hell inside the primary one. Residents could be denied food for days, locked in isolation cells, or forced to perform even more degrading public displays. The most common punishment was silencing. Lepers who spoke out against conditions were forbidden from speaking at all for periods ranging from weeks to months. In a world where they were already invisible, taking away their voice was the final erasure of their humanity. The breeding programs in some leprosaria represent perhaps the darkest chapter in this catalog of horrors. Certain institutions, particularly those with strong financial backing, began encouraging reproduction among residents, not out of any humanitarian concern, but because children born in leprosaria were considered especially pure examples of divine punishment. These infants, whether infected or not, became the next generation of living sermons, raised from birth to embody society's moral lessons about sin and suffering. The children born in these places were trained from infancy to perform their assigned role in the religious theater. They learned special prayers that emphasized their own corruption, practiced particular postures that displayed their deformities most effectively for visitors, and memorized speeches about gratitude for divine punishment. By adolescence, they had become perfectly calibrated instruments of moral instruction, their entire personalities shaped by the need to inspire pity and donations while taking no emotional sustenance for themselves. The educational system within leprosaria, yes, some had formal education programs, was designed to produce better beggars and more effective spiritual advertisements. Residents who could read were taught to recite passages from Scripture that emphasized themes of punishment and redemption. Those who could write were trained to compose letters, requesting donations that followed specific formulas designed to maximize emotional impact. The most articulate residents became spokespersons for the institution, their eloquent descriptions of suffering and gratitude serving as recruitment tools for new donors. The sexual economy within these places operated on principles that would make a modern trafficking operation seem straightforward by comparison. Because official church doctrine forbade sexual relationships among lepers, any intimacy that developed had to exist in shadows, creating opportunities for exploitation that the administrators either ignored or actively facilitated. Residents who still possessed some physical attractiveness found themselves in positions where they could trade sexual favors for better food, sleeping arrangements, or protection from the more degrading public displays. The pregnancy protocols in leprosaria reveal the full extent of medieval society's commitment to extracting maximum moral value from human suffering. When a resident became pregnant, the condition was announced to the surrounding community as proof that even divine punishment couldn't suppress sinful nature. The pregnancy itself became a fundraising opportunity, with special appeals for donations to support the care of an unborn child already marked by corruption. The birthing process was often conducted as a public spectacle, with wealthy donors invited to witness the arrival of a new example of inherited sin. The mother's labor pains were interpreted as divine justice in action, her suffering during childbirth seen as a preview of eternal punishment awaiting the unrepentant. If the child was born healthy, it was considered a miracle that inspired even greater donations. If it showed signs of infection, it was proof of hereditary corruption that validated the entire system of moral punishment. The death rituals in leprosaria were carefully choreographed performances that extracted meaning from suffering even after life had ended. Residents weren't just allowed to die. They were required to die properly, in ways that served the institution's educational mission. This meant public deathbed scenes where the dying person would confess their sins, express gratitude for their punishment, and encourage others to learn from their example. But here's the truly horrifying detail. Some residents were kept alive far beyond any natural lifespan, specifically to serve as examples of divine endurance. They were force-fed when they tried to refuse food, prevented from dying naturally so they could continue serving as living testimonies to God's justice. Their extended suffering wasn't mercy. It was performance art that used human agony as its medium. The record-keeping systems reveal that administrators tracked not just deaths, but the educational value extracted from each death. The most effective deathbed scenes, those that inspired the largest donations or the most dramatic conversions among witnesses, were preserved in written accounts that could be reproduced and shared with other institutions. These death narratives became a form of medieval snuff literature, circulated among religious communities as both entertainment and moral instruction. The apprenticeship programs in larger leprosaria created career paths in human degradation. Young men from religious families could learn the skills needed to manage these institutions, not medical skills, but techniques for maximizing the spiritual and financial yield from human suffering. They studied the optimal balance of care and neglect, learned to read the donation cycles and adjust resident conditions accordingly, and mastered the rhetoric needed to frame cruelty as charity. These apprentice administrators would rotate between different leprosaria, sharing best practices for extracting maximum value from misery. They developed standardized protocols for intake procedures, resident management, donor cultivation, and death preparation. The system became so refined that leprosaria could be franchised like modern businesses, with proven methods for turning human suffering into sustainable revenue stream. The International Network of Leprosaria created a medieval economy based entirely on the commodification of abandonment. Institutions would trade residents like livestock, moving particularly effective beggars to locations where their appearance would generate maximum donations. The most successful lepers, those whose combination of visible suffering and articulate gratitude made them ideal fundraising tools, could command premium prices in these human markets. The travel circuits connecting various leprosaria created what amounted to a medieval touring industry, with wealthy patrons planning grand tours that would take them to the most famous concentrations of holy suffering. These spiritual tourists would arrive with prepared donation amounts, expecting to witness specific levels of degradation and gratitude. The residents learned to perform their suffering on cue, displaying their decay with the practiced skill of professional entertainers. But the most chilling aspect of this entire system was how completely it normalized the idea that some people's suffering was not only acceptable, but spiritually necessary. Medieval society didn't just tolerate leprosaria. It celebrated them as proof of divine wisdom and human compassion. The worse conditions became, the more certain people felt that they were witnessing God's justice in action. This wasn't primitive ignorance or medieval brutality. It was sophisticated, systematic, and considered the height of civilized behavior. The people who designed, funded, and operated these institutions were the moral leaders of their communities, the educated elite who set the standards for Christian virtue. They weren't monsters hiding in shadows. They were pillars of society operating in full daylight, convinced they were doing God's work. And that should terrify you more than any of the physical horrors I've described. Because it means that normal, decent, civilized people are capable of creating and maintaining systems of breathtaking cruelty as long as they can convince themselves that the suffering serves some higher purpose. The medieval leprosarium wasn't an aberration. It was civilization functioning exactly as designed, with all the efficiency and moral certainty that education and organization can provide. Look around your modern world and ask yourself, what are we so certain about today that future generations will recognize as our own version of the leprosarium? What suffering are we normalizing by dressing it up in moral language? What cruelties are we systematizing while convincing ourselves we're being civilized and compassionate? Because I guarantee you, somewhere in your comfortable modern life, there are people rotting in institutions you help maintain while you congratulate yourself on your humanitarian values. But we're not done yet, not even close, because what I'm about to show you will shatter any remaining illusions you might have about human progress, moral evolution, or the idea that medieval cruelty was somehow primitive compared to modern enlightenment. The leprosarium didn't disappear. It perfected itself, learned to speak new languages, and discovered more efficient ways to transform human suffering into social virtue. Let me take you inside the daily reality of leprosarium existence in ways that will make your comfortable assumptions about medieval life crumble like diseased flesh. You think you understand what I've been describing, but you're still viewing it through the sanitized lens of historical distance. Strip that away. Feel the stone floor beneath your rotting feet. Taste the metallic fear in your mouth when you wake up to find another piece of yourself has fallen off during the night. Morning in a leprosarium began before dawn with the sound of wooden clappers announcing the first prayer service. But this wasn't a gentle call to worship. It was the clatter of decay, the percussion section of an orchestra made entirely of decomposing instruments. Each clapper's sound was different depending on what was left of the hands holding it. Some produced sharp, clean strikes. Others made muffled thuds as stumps wrapped in cloth attempted to maintain rhythm. The newest residents could still manage complex rhythms. The advanced cases produced only irregular tapping. like death knocking inconsistently at its own door. The prayer itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as spiritual instruction. Every word was chosen to reinforce the residents' status as moral lessons rather than human beings. We thank thee, Lord, for the corruption that reveals our inner nature, they would recite in unison, voices at various stages of vocal cord deterioration. We praise thee for the suffering that purifies our souls. The words became automatic, but their psychological impact was cumulative and devastating. After prayers came the morning inspection. Not a medical examination, but a catalog of decay for administrative purposes. Residents would line up in order of their arrival date, and a clerk would note changes in their condition. But these weren't health records. They were inventory assessments. Number 23 shows increased facial deterioration, good for public display. Number 67's hands have progressed to optimal begging configuration. Number 12, near expiration, transfer to back quarters to avoid negative visitor impact. The work assignments revealed the true genius of the leprosarium system. Residents weren't given tasks based on their remaining abilities, but on the educational value their performance could provide to observers. Those with partially functional hands might be assigned to weaving, but not to create useful products, to demonstrate how sin corrupted even the most basic human activities. Their twisted, failing attempts at normal tasks became object lessons in divine justice for visitors to witness. The most disturbing work assignment was storytelling. Residents with intact vocal cords were required to develop personal narratives that explained their condition in morally instructive ways. These weren't true stories. They were carefully crafted moral fables that residents had to memorize and perform on demand. A woman whose infection might have come from contaminated water had to claim it resulted from adultery. A man whose leprosy was clearly hereditary had to attribute it to his own supposed sexual sins. They became actors in a play that rewrote their entire life histories to serve the institution's educational mission. The visitors' protocols were even more elaborate than I initially described. Wealthy patrons didn't just observe passively. They participated in interactive moral education experiences. They could pay extra to conduct personal interviews with selected residents, asking prepared questions designed to elicit responses that would confirm their existing beliefs about sin, punishment, and social order. Tell me about the moment you realized your corruption, they might ask, while a clerk recorded both question and answer for future educational use. Some leprosaria offered what they called spiritual immersion experiences for particularly wealthy donors. These patrons could spend a day dressed in leper clothing, eating leper food, and participating in leper routines, but with the absolute guarantee that they could return to their comfortable lives whenever they chose. This religious tourism allowed people to feel they had experienced suffering without actually risking anything, confirming their sense of moral superiority while providing thrilling entertainment. The seasonal festivals in leprosaria created annual cycles of intensified horror. Easter celebrations required residents to reenact the crucifixion, with the most disfigured playing the role of Christ to demonstrate how sin corrupts even divine suffering. Christmas pageants cast lepers as demons and devils, their physical decay serving as costumes in morality plays that reinforced every negative stereotype about their condition. These weren't religious celebrations. They were theatrical productions that used human degradation as both script and cast. The correspondence systems in these institutions reveal layers of cruelty that go beyond mere abandonment. Families were encouraged to write letters to their leprous relatives, but these letters had to follow strict formats that emphasized moral instruction over personal connection. I pray daily for your purification through suffering was an acceptable sentiment. I miss you and wish you could come home was not. Letters that expressed too much affection or failed to properly frame the leper's condition as divine justice were returned unopened. But here's the detail that should make your skin crawl. Some leprosaria offered letter-writing services for families who wanted to maintain contact but couldn't bear to write personally. Professional scribes would compose morally appropriate correspondence on behalf of relatives, creating the illusion of family connection while ensuring that every word reinforced the leper's status as a spiritual lesson rather than a loved one. These ghost-written relationships became elaborate fiction that satisfied family guilt while maintaining emotional distance. The medical experimentation in leprosaria went far beyond crude attempts at treatment. These institutions became laboratories for testing theories about moral corruption made physical. Doctors weren't trying to cure leprosy. They were exploring their relationship between spiritual depravity and bodily decay. They would deliberately expose residents to different conditions, foods, and environments to see how moral corruption manifested physically under various circumstances. The most horrifying experiments involved attempts to induce leprosy in healthy subjects, usually prisoners or condemned criminals, who were told they could earn redemption by participating in studies of divine justice. These human test subjects were exposed to infected materials, forced to live in close contact with advanced cases, and subjected to conditions designed to encourage disease transmission. When they inevitably became infected, their progression was carefully documented as evidence of how quickly sin could corrupt previously healthy flesh. Some institutions developed breeding programs specifically designed to produce children who could serve as experimental subjects from birth. These infants were exposed to various combinations of infected materials, different diets, and controlled environments to determine which factors most influenced the development and progression of leprosy. The children who became infected were celebrated as valuable research subjects. Those who remained healthy were considered failures and often abandoned or sold to other institutions. The documentation from these experiments reveals that administrators were less interested in understanding leprosy as a medical condition than in proving their theological theories about the relationship between moral behavior and physical health. They wanted empirical evidence that sin literally rotted the body, that divine punishment operated through natural processes, and that visible corruption reflected invisible spiritual decay. The most successful leprosaria developed what amounted to franchising systems, with standardized procedures that could be replicated across different locations and cultures. Master administrators would travel between institutions, sharing techniques for maximizing the moral and financial yield from human suffering. They published manuals with titles like The Profitable Management of Divine Justice and Maximizing Charitable Returns Through Effective Misery Administration. These management guides included detailed instructions for every aspect of leprosarium operation, from architectural specifications that enhanced visitor emotional impact to seasonal scheduling that synchronized resident suffering with donation cycles. They provided scripts for resident interviews, formulas for calculating optimal food ratios that maintained visible desperation without causing counterproductive deaths, and marketing strategies for attracting wealthy patrons, seeking spiritual enhancement through proximity to holy suffering. The international trade in leprosarium expertise created a medieval consulting industry built entirely around the commercialization of abandonment. Successful administrators commanded high fees for their knowledge of suffering optimization, and the most profitable institutions attracted investors who funded expansion into new markets. The system became so sophisticated that leprosaria could predict their annual revenue based on factors like regional economic conditions, seasonal religious observances, and the demographic composition of their resident population. The training programs for leprosarium staff created professional careers in systematic cruelty. Young men from religious families could specialize in various aspects of the business: resident management, donor relations, facility optimization, or spiritual programming. They learned techniques that wouldn't be out of place in modern corporate training programs, except their product was human degradation and their market was guilty conscience. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire system was its complete integration into normal medieval society. Leprosaria weren't hidden away as shameful secrets. They were celebrated as crown jewels of Christian civilization. Kings and nobles competed to fund the most impressive facilities. Church leaders held up the most successful institutions as models of divine wisdom in action. Philosophers used leprosaria as examples when discussing the proper relationship between suffering and salvation. The residents themselves were exhibited at major social events, their suffering serving as entertainment at royal celebrations and religious festivals. They were paraded through city streets during holy days, their decay on full display as mobile sermons about divine justice. The most articulate among them were invited to deliver speeches at important gatherings, sharing their gratitude for punishment and encouraging others to support the institutions that made such spiritual education possible. The educational system built around leprosaria influenced everything from university curricula to children's moral instruction. Medical students studied not how to treat leprosy, but how to recognize divine punishment in physical form. Theology students learned to interpret different stages of decay as evidence of specific sins. Philosophy students debated whether the suffering of lepers proved or disproved various theories about divine justice and human nature. Children's literature of the period included numerous stories featuring leprosaria as settings for moral education, with young protagonists learning important lessons about virtue and vice through encounters with grateful sufferers. These tales weren't presented as fiction. They were considered accurate representations of how divine justice operated in the real world, teaching children to expect punishment for moral failings and to view suffering as evidence of deserved consequences. The economic impact of the leprosarium system extended far beyond the institutions themselves. Entire industries developed around supplying these facilities: specialized clothing manufacturers, food producers who could provide just enough nutrition to maintain visible desperation, construction companies that knew how to build for maximum psychological impact. The suffering of lepers supported thousands of jobs and generated enormous economic activity. But the most insidious legacy of the medieval leprosarium wasn't economic or architectural, it was psychological. The system trained entire societies to view certain categories of people as moral lessons rather than human beings, to find spiritual comfort in others' suffering, and to mistake organized cruelty for civilized virtue. These weren't primitive responses to medical ignorance. They were sophisticated social technologies for managing guilt, maintaining hierarchy, and extracting meaning from misery. And those technologies didn't disappear when leprosy became treatable or when medieval society evolved into modernity. They adapted, updated their language, and found new populations to process through systems of sanctified abandonment. The fundamental machinery of the leprosarium, the ability to transform suffering into virtue, abandonment into charity, and systematic cruelty into moral education, that machinery is still running, still processing human lives, still generating profit and self-satisfaction for people who are absolutely convinced they're doing good in the world. So here we are at the end of our journey into the medieval heart of darkness, and I need you to understand something that's going to haunt you for the rest of your life. Everything I've shown you, every horror, every systematic cruelty, every innovation in human degradation, none of it was aberrant behavior by monsters or madmen. It was the logical, inevitable result of normal people operating within systems that rewarded the right kind of thinking and punished the wrong kind of compassion. The medieval leprosarium succeeded because it solved multiple social problems simultaneously while allowing everyone involved to feel virtuous about their participation. It disposed of unwanted people without the guilt of outright murder. It provided visible proof that moral rules had consequences, reinforcing social order through fear. It created economic opportunities for administrators, builders, suppliers, and religious professionals. It offered wealthy people a way to purchase salvation through charitable donations, and it gave ordinary citizens regular opportunities to witness suffering that made their own lives seem blessed by comparison. But most importantly, it established the template for how civilized societies could systematically destroy human beings while maintaining their self-image as compassionate and moral. The leprosarium proved that you could torture people to death slowly, in public, with the full support of law, religion, and popular opinion, as long as you framed the torture as mercy and the death as redemption. That template didn't die with medieval Europe. It evolved, refined itself, and learned to speak the languages of every subsequent era. The basic operating principles of the leprosarium, identification of undesirable populations, moral justification for their suffering, economic benefit from their degradation, and social reinforcement through public display, these principles have been applied repeatedly throughout history, always with the same confident certainty that this time the suffering really is necessary and justified. Think about the colonial residential schools that separated indigenous children from their families to kill the Indian and save the man. Same technology, updated language. The children were processed through institutions designed to destroy their cultural identity while extracting economic and political benefits for the colonizers. Their suffering was framed as education, their cultural death as salvation, their abuse as civilization. The administrators weren't monsters. They were respected educators, government officials, and religious leaders who genuinely believed they were doing God's work. Consider the American mental asylum system of the 19th and early 20th centuries, where hundreds of thousands of people were confined for life based on diagnoses like moral insanity or hysteria. The institutions were profitable enterprises that warehoused inconvenient people, while providing career opportunities for medical professionals and validation for families who couldn't cope with difficult relatives. The inmates were exhibited to medical students, wealthy patrons, and curious visitors as examples of what happened when mental discipline failed. Their suffering was framed as treatment, their confinement as protection, their degradation as scientific progress. Or examine the modern American prison system, which houses more people than medieval Europe's entire population, disproportionately targeting communities that lack political power, while generating billions in revenue for private companies and providing jobs for millions of guards, administrators, and support staff. The inmates are displayed on reality television shows and documentaries that confirm viewers' beliefs about crime, punishment, and moral order. Their suffering is framed as justice, their exploitation as rehabilitation, their desperation as deserved consequences. Each iteration of the leprosarium technology claims to be more enlightened than the last, but the fundamental mechanics remain identical. Identify a population that can be blamed for their own condition, create institutions that profit from their degradation while claiming to help them, use their visible suffering to reinforce social hierarchies and moral certainties, train normal, decent people to participate in systematic cruelty while feeling good about themselves. The most terrifying aspect isn't the cruelty itself. It's how easily ordinary people adapt to systems that require them to ignore suffering or participate in causing it. Medieval Europeans weren't inherently more evil than modern people. They were just operating within different institutional frameworks that made certain kinds of thinking seem natural and others seem impossible. The residents of medieval leprosaria weren't victims of primitive ignorance. They were products of sophisticated social engineering. Their administrators weren't crude sadists. They were skilled professionals working within well-developed systems that had been refined over centuries. The donors who supported these institutions weren't callous monsters. They were concerned citizens participating in what their society had taught them to recognize as charity and justice. And that's exactly what makes this historical nightmare so relevant to your comfortable modern existence. Because right now, today, while you're congratulating yourself on living in a more enlightened era, there are millions of people being processed through updated versions of the same systems. The technology has improved, the language has evolved, but the fundamental machinery of sanctified abandonment is still operating at full capacity. Your modern leprosaria are climate refugees warehoused in detention centers. their suffering framed as border security and their children's trauma presented as necessary deterrent to others who might seek similar refuge. Their elderly people dying alone in understaffed nursing homes, their neglect rationalized as cost-effective care and their families' guilt assuaged by institutional rhetoric about dignity and comfort. Their homeless populations swept from visibility into encampments on the edges of cities, their displacement presented as public health measures, and their desperation exhibited in documentaries that allow viewers to feel simultaneously concerned and superior. Their prisoners in solitary confinement cells, their psychological destruction labeled as security protocols, and their eventual madness cited as evidence of their inherent dangerousness. Their patients in psychiatric facilities, where profit margins determine treatment options, their medications selected based on cost rather than effectiveness, while their families are sold narratives about recovery that justify continued institutionalization. Their workers in developing countries whose poisoning by industrial chemicals is presented as economic development and whose shortened lifespans are calculated as acceptable externalities in global supply chains. Each of these modern systems operates according to the same principles that governed medieval leprosaria. The suffering population is blamed for their condition. They chose to migrate illegally, failed to save adequately for retirement, became addicted to drugs, committed crimes, developed mental illness, or lived in countries that prioritized industrial growth over worker safety. Their pain serves educational purposes, as warnings to others, as confirmation of moral rules, as evidence that the world is basically just and suffering is generally deserved. The institutions that process them generate profits and provide employment while allowing society to feel it's addressing social problems through organized compassion. The visible nature of their degradation reinforces existing hierarchies. People who avoid these systems can feel blessed, chosen, or simply smart enough to make better life choices. And just like in medieval times, the people who design, fund, and operate these systems aren't monsters hiding in shadows. They're respected professionals, elected officials, religious leaders, and concerned citizens who genuinely believe they're doing necessary work in a complicated world. They use the same moral language that justified medieval leprosaria. Compassion, justice, practical necessity, divine will, or natural law. The most successful modern systems even incorporate feedback mechanisms that allow participants to feel they're learning from past mistakes. Prison reformers advocate for more humane conditions, while accepting the fundamental premise that mass incarceration is necessary. Immigration activists push for better treatment of detention center inhabitants while rarely questioning why detention is required at all. Mental health advocates demand improved psychiatric care while assuming that institutionalization remains the appropriate response to psychological distress. These reform movements serve the same function as medieval religious rhetoric about caring for lepers. They provide moral cover for systems of systematic abandonment by creating the impression that someone is working to make things better. The reforms usually focus on surface conditions rather than underlying structures, ensuring that the fundamental machinery continues operating, while participants feel they are part of the solution rather than the problem. But here's what should absolutely terrify you. The people living inside these modern systems often experience the same psychological transformations as medieval lepers. They learn to internalize the moral frameworks that justify their treatment, accepting responsibility for conditions beyond their control, while expressing gratitude for whatever minimal care they receive. They perform their suffering for audiences that need to believe the pain serves some purpose. They become living sermons about the importance of making correct choices and following social rules. The children growing up in these systems learn the same lessons as those medieval infants born in leprosaria, that some people matter less than others, that visible suffering indicates moral failing, and that systematic abandonment can be disguised as institutional care. They're being trained to participate in the next iteration of these systems, to accept their moral foundations, and to find their own roles as either processors or processed. And the most chilling part is how invisible this machinery becomes to people who benefit from it. Just as medieval Europeans could walk past leprosaria every day without really seeing them, modern people navigate around encampments, detention centers, prisons, and nursing homes without recognizing them as components of the same basic system. The suffering is simultaneous everywhere and nowhere, visible but not acknowledged, documented but not understood. You live in a world where the medieval leprosarium has been perfected into an entire civilization based on the systematic processing of human suffering through institutions that extract profit while providing moral satisfaction to participants. The scale has expanded beyond anything medieval Europeans could have imagined. The efficiency has increased exponentially, and the moral certainty remains absolutely intact. Every day you make choices that either support or resist these systems, but the resistance is much harder than support because the systems are designed to make participation feel natural, necessary, and virtuous. You're surrounded by modern leprosaria, but they've been integrated so thoroughly into the normal landscape that recognizing them requires the kind of radical perspective shift that most people find impossible. So the next time you pass by someone whose suffering has been systematized, institutionalized, and morally justified, whether they're behind bars, fences, walls, or just the invisible barriers that mark them as belonging to categories of people whose pain doesn't really count, remember that you're looking at the direct descendant of the medieval leprosarium. The faces change, the languages evolve, but the machinery that transforms human suffering into social virtue keeps running, keeps processing, keeps generating profit and righteousness for people who are absolutely convinced they're better than their medieval ancestors. The medieval leprosarium never ended. It just learned to hide its true face behind more sophisticated masks. And until you can see through those masks, until you can recognize the systems that surround you for what they really are, you're not living in a more enlightened age. You're just living in a more efficient version of the same ancient nightmare, convinced that this time the suffering really is necessary and the abandonment really is mercy.